Now, thanks for joining us for the third of our study sessions in the life of David. We've reached 1 Samuel 18 today, and we're looking at David in the palace of King Saul. David as a servant to King Saul. He's moved from a shepherd boy in 1 Samuel 16 to a soldier defeating Goliath in chapter 17 to now employed in the service of Saul in the palace. Let's read 1 Samuel 18 together. 1 Samuel 18:1 says, "And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would not let him go more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was about him, that was upon him, and he gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth with the saying, and the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. It came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand, as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast a javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. And therefore Saul removed him from him, and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. And Saul said to David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, Let not my hand be upon him, and let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said to Saul, Who am I? And what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel, the Meholathite, to wife. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hands of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law, in one of the twain. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, Commune with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spake these words in the ear of David. And David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. And Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskin of the Philistines, to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul sought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and gave them back in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David. And Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass, after they went forth, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. And we're sure that God will bless the reading of the Holy Scriptures. Now, we've been thinking about David, and we've been thinking about David as a shepherd boy, and David as a soldier defeating Goliath. And we're now going to think about him here in the palace of King Saul as a servant to King Saul and ultimately the king's son-in-law. So we've been thinking about David's call in chapter 16 and the great conflict in the battlefield in chapter 17, but now it's the challenges in the palace. And what he's going to learn is that this was a poisoned chalice, this promotion. Promotion sometimes is. The envy in the heart of King Saul would lead to a greater set of difficulties than he faced when he faced Goliath of Gath. And the challenges in the palace were greater than the challenges in the battlefield with the Philistines. And we're going to learn how we have to be wise and how we can handle envy, and we're going to learn about the tactics that can be used to derail us in this particular chapter. So, the first thing I'd like to speak about is this chapter's about wisdom. I try to emphasise it in the readings. In verse number 5, for example, you'll see that it says that David behaved himself wisely, and then again in verse number 15, he behaved himself very wisely. Verse 14, he behaved himself wisely. The last verse, we were reading it there, behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. If chapter 16 is about humility and chapter 17 is about courage and faith, well, this chapter is very much about wisdom. I'd like to speak about, first of all, the wisdom that was seen by Jonathan in the first few verses here. Because, you see, there is a wisdom in humility. Jonathan divests himself of his robe and of his sword and of his bow and of his girdle. It says there in verse number 4. And Jonathan gave them all to David. Jonathan recognised the greatness in David and that he was really saying that he thought that David had the right to the throne. Now, Jonathan would have been the one who would be the successor to his father, King Saul, and yet he was recognising a greatness in David that he didn't think he had in himself. Isn't that wonderful? You know, there is something most illuminating about the type of wisdom we see here in the first few verses, that there is something about Jonathan's recognition of David's greatness. It is hard to play second fiddle, it always is. But you know what? It's great when you can see greatness in others and to see something of the work of God in another life. And that's a mark of greatness in its own right. And so there's a wisdom seen here in humility. But in the first few verses, we also see a wisdom in inclusivity. You say, what do you mean? Well, David is given a position of being captain over the army of King Saul. And when we read the verse that says that David was given this, verse number 3, is it? Yes, verse number 3. Verse number 5, where David is actually given the position of authority, it says that David behaved himself wisely, and all the people accepted him. He was accepted in the sight of all the people. And there's just something about what it says about David when he was given that promotion, which I think is really interesting. You might not know, but in my previous life, before I was doing what I'm doing now, I was involved in education here in Scotland and the improvement of schools and so on. And I liked when a head teacher in a school took an interest in the janitor and the dinner ladies as much as in the teaching staff, took an interest in everybody. And there's something about true leadership that reaches out to everyone. And that's what we've got here in verse 5. He was accepted in the sight of all the people. He wasn't just accepted in the sight of the top brass in Saul's court. David found favour with the common person in the army and in the country as a whole. And the people loved David. And it's great when those who seek to be leaders amongst God's people reach out to everyone. And David was certainly marked by that feature. It says in Colossians 4, we're to walk in wisdom towards them that are without, redeeming the time. And the world will tell you whether you're reaching out to them or you're not. And so there's just a little touch here about the wisdom of inclusivity. Our gospel, you know, is for every man and woman and every boy and girl. We preach a whosoever gospel, and we tell them that God loves them, no matter what the colour of their skin is, their ethnicity, their social standing, rich or poor, old or young, male or female, irrespective of who they think they are, God loves them. And so we should be exercised about this inclusivity of reaching out to absolutely everyone and not fall into the trap of just remembering those who love us back or look like us or are in some way we feel connected to us. And that's what David did. David behaved himself wisely before everyone and was accepted in the sight of all the people and in the sight of all of Saul's servants. But then, so there's this discernment that marks David, which I think is fascinating. But then there's a little ditty gets sung, and I suppose there's a lack of wisdom seen in this ditty. The women are singing a song that goes something like this here, and we read about this in verse number 7 in the next little section, that Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And they're beginning to sing this and dance this. Now, we should be aware that where you make elaborate public praise, it can have drastic effect on people, especially those who have a propensity for jealousy. Do not compare people in public. Very simple. Don't do it. Don't do it on social media platforms. Don't do it verbally. Don't do it in any way. This is what happened here, and the song that those women sang deeply angered King Saul. The hinge in the chapter happens at that point that Saul was very wroth, it says there in that verse. And Saul was very, very angry. And the saying displeased him, it says. And he realises that they've ascribed to David tens of thousands and only to him thousands. And we have that expression there in verse 9. He eyed David from that day and forward. Yeah, the little ditty issue had ballooned out of control because it was handled badly. And what now has happened is the green-eyed monster has entered into the soul of King Saul, and envy has resulted. And Saul will ultimately behave like an animal shortly, and it will lead to tragic end. This man will ultimately go and see a witch in 1 Samuel 30. You have no idea the end point of what was started here in this chapter. So, brothers and sisters, let's not forget that envy eats away inside us like cancer. And there's a little verse in the Proverbs that says, a sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy is the rottenness of the bones. Proverbs 14:30. Envy is the pain that we feel within us when someone achieves or receives what we think rightly belongs to us. You ever experienced that? Most human beings have at some point. And, it's actually being aware when this happens, because if it's unchecked, it can lead to outrageous behaviour. The proverb says again, wrath is cruel and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? So people can make silly statements, and we have to be aware that people will do that and they shouldn't. And we have to be very, very wise in what comes out of our mouth and not compare people in public. But silly statements, it's never right for us to act in a jealous manner. And unchecked anger and unchecked envy grows and pushes us down paths where it's very difficult to make U-turns. We need to be sensitive to sin in our life, and we need to know where unjudged sin leads. And so in this little section here, we're seeing something of the lack of wisdom by the woman, and the flattery that they're showing, which is a lack of discernment through a little ditty. Remember, it's the little things that grow, and small things matter. But then there's a direct attack. So there's a kind of third element here as we get into verses verse number 10, 11, 12, 13, this section here. There's a direct attack upon David. And the direct attack comes from the spear of King Saul. And David is playing his harp to soothe the king's nerves and to refresh him. And the envy is building up in the heart of Saul. And he throws a javelin at David. And David avoids it, and it strikes into the wall behind him. He does it twice, actually. And on both occasions, David avoids it. He manages just to duck at the last moment, and the javelin goes past his ears into the wall. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to think with you just for a second about near misses. How many near misses have we had in our life? Sometimes those near misses are of our own making, and other times they're done by people that should know better. But you know, the psalmist did have to say in Psalm 73, "As for me, my feet were almost gone, my steps had well nigh slipped." He says, I was almost away. He says, until I went into the sanctuary, and then I understood therein. You know, David could write in Psalm 40, "Blessed is the man that maketh the Lord his trust." He proved it here in the palace, because swerving from javelins was harder work than slaying giants in the previous chapter. You see, brothers and sisters, we're living in an age, and we're living in an era, and we're living in a situation where there will be javelins flung at us. There will be near misses. There will be snares and traps for us as God's people. And I think all of us could say in the words of Lamentations, every morning we can say, it's of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning, great is thy faithfulness. And we don't know what God has preserved us from until we get home to heaven. And so there is temptations going to come our way. There's testings going to come our way. But the good thing is, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, there is no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. And he asks us to flee from idolatry. And the answer to this one was to duck, to avoid it. And that's exactly what David did. Now, sometimes we've got to stand up, and sometimes we've got to run. In David's case here, he had to run. You know, when Paul was in Iconium, in Acts chapter 14, he fled as they sought to stone him. But in Antioch, he stayed. And it's good to know when we have to stand up and be courageous and fight the Goliaths. And it's good to know when we've got to flee from idolatry, or flee fornication, or flee like Joseph from Potiphar's wife, and certainly flee here as David did from the javelins of King Saul, because there's direct attacks going to come upon us. But then the fourth strategy to derail David was demotion. Demotion. You see, there's a wisdom seen in evading javelins in the previous section, but when we get into the next bit of our chapter here, there was a wisdom seen in his dignity and his duty when he was demoted. You'll see this in verses 13 to 16. You'll notice it says in verse 13, "Therefore Saul removed from him and made him a captain over 1,000. So direct attack has failed to change David. So Saul demotes him instead. And instead of being in charge of all of the army of Israel, he's placed in charge of 1,000 men. Have you ever been demoted? You ever know what it means to suddenly no longer have the authority you once had, and perhaps your salary slashed, and your sense of position in the company or the organisation you're in no longer the same? It's not a particularly nice experience. And David knew what it was to be deliberately prejudiced against and to be demoted. And what I love about it here is, it says that when he was demoted, look at what it says in verse 16, that he behaved himself wisely. That sense of dignity and that sense of duty was seen even when people were demoting him. You know, we can learn important lessons about the way that David behaved here, not just before an employer that employs us, because employers today can envy their employees at times, and Christians will come under attack, and there will be direct attacks, and there will be demotion. But sometimes, you know, you might not be getting the place in the assembly, you think, or someone else begins to do the job that you used to do. And, you know, we can begin to feel like we're less well thought of. And these same feelings can come upon us. And how do we handle that when that happens? When someone else is given the job we always did in the assembly, or or somewhere else in our workplace or the family, well, we have to behave wisely and to remember who it is we're serving, for we serve the Lord Christ. When Paul was writing to slaves, and I don't suppose any one of us has been a slave, but he was writing to real slaves who had real masters, and he says in Colossians 3, "Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord." And he makes the point that really they're serving the Lord in their daily work. And your boss, well, he might be a rude individual, but give him some respect for his office if you can't respect the man. But remember this, your ultimate master is Christ himself. So don't do it just to please the boss, and don't do it with eye service just when he's looking, but do it with the eye of God upon you. And whether it's assembly life or civil life, or whether it's work life or family life, let's not forget then, when circumstances come upon us and we've no longer got the position of responsibility that we once had, to behave with dignity and with diligence. And it's only done by God's grace. How would you like to be Jacob when Uncle Laban changed your wages 10 times? That must have been a hard trial. And yet, you know, it was during that period that God blessed Jacob in a remarkable way. Or Joseph being wrongly accused by Potiphar, thrown out of his good job and into the prison. And yet when he was in the prison, it says the Lord was with him. He conducted himself in an edifying manner, in a dignified way. I believe we have an opportunity in the world around us, as bad things happen to us, to show that we can act in dignity. The world will be impressed, not when they see you doing well when the sun is shining, but when they see you behaving with dignity in the winds of affliction and when there's direct attack upon your Christian faith. So we have an opportunity in the world of employment to testify like David to the unsaved and to show the wisdom of dignity and duty even in demotion. Now, a damaged heart is the next section, and you know, in the next little section that's before us here, which would be when Saul begins to play around with David's heart, it starts in verse number 17 of our chapter. You see, Saul's not finished with David, and he tries to damage his heart. If he can't destroy him physically, he'll destroy him mentally or morally. He promised him his daughter as a wife, and he builds all his hopes up, and then dashes it by, when the time comes for the wedding, giving his daughter to another man. The proverb says, "Hope deferred maketh a man sick," Proverbs 13:12. And many a Christian who's been able to hold their own in intellectual debate on the scriptures, coming under attack by atheists or even physical opposition for the cause of Christ, have stumbled when it comes to the matters of the heart. Deliberately playing around with another person's emotions is wicked. That's exactly what Saul's doing to David here. And David appears to pass the test at this point. He'll be tested on again and on this same again, but at this point, the issue of the test on his emotions and his affections, he passes. And I think the Proverbs have good advice for David, and perhaps he passed it on to Solomon, which is why it's in the book of Proverbs in chapter 4. "Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." Watch who you give your heart to. That's really what that scripture's saying. And Saul is playing around with David's heart. But David passes the test. His heart seems to be resolutely on behaving himself in a manner that's becoming to his God. It might not be the promise of a wife. It might be the promise of promotion, the promise of an inheritance, or something else that's taken away at the very last minute. And we have been aware, even in recent years, of people who've been not long saved and things like inheritance removed from them at the last minute. And hope deferred makes the heart sick. There's a man in Scotland called Geoffrey Bull. He was in assemblies in Glasgow. He was captured by the Chinese in Tibet in 1950s, and he was incarcerated by them for many, many years. And he wrote a book, When Iron Gates Yield. And that was a verse he wrote a lot about. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, because the Chinese guards would tell him he was going to be liberated. They'd give him the date and the time and so on, and then just before it, they would default on it. And it was all to try and break him and crack him. And that's what Saul's doing here. He's trying to break David's heart. And that verse then is one you should treasure. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Who are you giving your heart to? Paul would say to the Ephesians that for this cause he bowed his knees to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom every family in heaven and earth is named, that they would become to understand that what it is to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. But in that context of that prayer, it says that Christ may dwell in your heart by faith. And just to enjoy Christ in our own souls will save us from distractions of the world around us as they dangle things in front of us that are sometimes illicit and sometimes reasonable, but they actually have no intentions to see it carried through. But then there's a sixth attack here in this chapter to try and derail David. And again, it's King Saul, and again it relates to a matter of the heart. But it's a dangerous task he sets David. And if there's a wisdom seen in the way that David acts in an orderly way and holds himself together with integrity before the Lord, despite the emotional attack, this final one is a really difficult one. Saul notices that his daughter Michal has an interest romantically in David. And this man in his cruelty uses his daughter's feelings to lure David. And so he sends his servants to indicate to David that there's a willingness for David to come into the royal family. And he says, he first of all seeks to encourage David to become part of the royal family. But knowing that David would not have any ability to pay the dowry for a king's daughter, being a shepherd boy who's just been catapulted into the palace, he tells him that he doesn't want any dowry. He only wants 100 Philistines dead, the 100 foreskins of the Philistines brought to him. And what he's doing is he's dangling in front of David a place in the royal family, part of the dynasty of the royal family, whilst at the same time giving him such a dangerous task to do that he's going to destroy him. If he can't kill him with his own javelin, he'll kill him by proxy through the Philistines. This is the stated intention, and the Spirit of God tells us what the intention was of Saul in this final section. And it's interesting that it's in this connection again, we read in verse 29, that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. You know, there was a wisdom, even in his poverty. You see, he was a poor man, and he had no capacity to pay that dowry. And yet there was a wisdom that was marked by David, because you see, David saw the Philistines not as a dangerous task set by King Saul, but as enemies of the Lord of hosts who had no right to the divine inheritance. So instead of killing 100, he killed 200. And it must have been a great shock to King Saul to see how much the Lord was with David. But going back to this idea of playing on our hearts and setting unobtainable goals for people, the world of commerce is full of that. Some of you Christians on the line here will know that you've been set unobtainable goals by your employers, and they want every ounce of your energy, and they're dangling in front of you the idea of promotion, a seat on the board, and something forward, and as a result of that, they're asking and demanding of you things which are ridiculous. And material word is a promise. And many of you are in careers which are kind of locked into this type of practice. And we need grace before God to act wisely in those circumstances. And it's good to ask, what are we chasing and wanting from in our employment? The time may come when some of you will have to leave the employment you're in because of the practices that they're doing, which are you're no longer able to maintain your Christian integrity. The challenge set by Saul of killing Philistines is deliberate, setting before him what appears to be a spiritual task, killing the enemies of the Lord's people, for carnal gain. Now, the work of God never promises material reward. Any gospel that promotes material prosperity for spiritual activity is a false gospel, and it's warned about by Paul in 2 Timothy 3 in the first 7 verses. He speaks a lot about it in the pastoral epistles, supposing that gain is a way of godliness. The Pentecostal movement has pervaded throughout the world, and with it has come a prosperity gospel, and it's a false gospel. Brothers and sisters, never anywhere in our Bible are we promised that through spiritual activity there will be material reward. He'll meet our needs, but there's never any thought of material remuneration on it. And so there is something about being aware of the tactics that the world will give us, and the tactics to derail us, the tactics to demote us. And David is displaying wisdom here, despite direct physical attack, despite demotion from his position of employment, despite a damaged heart through a false hope of a marriage. And some of you might have been there with that, kind of playing around with your heart, or the dangerous task set in exchange for incredible reward. And David's learning that swerving from javelins in the palace is harder work than slaying giants in the battlefield. David will one day in chapter 26 hand the javelin back to Saul. The very javelin, the very spear that was trying to throw it at him. That's the level of integrity that this man is showing. He is showing wisdom and duty and dignity in all of these situations. We too must learn that the success yesterday with the Goliaths of this world does not mean success tomorrow. And the giant that he'd fought, Goliath, the great giant of fear, needs to be killed. And there are some giants that we need to fight, but there are other giants we need to run from. Joseph, he ran from Potiphar's wife, the great giant of lust. We just need to run from it. 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee fornication. Promotion and prosperity can sometimes lead to a greater test than poverty and adversity, as David found, as he moved from being a shepherd boy to serving in the palace. Now, he's not long going to be in this palace. In chapter 19, Jonathan will intervene for him. Samuel will intercede for him. Even Michael will do some intrigue for him. But ultimately, when you get into chapter 20, David is running from the palace. And he's no longer a servant of King Saul. He's a stateless person. He's a sojourner. He's a stranger. And it's my desire that tomorrow we're going to pick up the stranger David as he runs from the palace and ends up in a cave called Adullam in 1 Samuel 22. And we'll begin to look no longer as David as a shepherd boy or as a soldier or as a servant in the King Saul's palace, but as a stranger in Judah in the cave of Adullam. May God bless you, and may these truths that are contained in these sections be used to help us as God's people walk wisely before God. Thank you.